Good evening, dear listener. It is August 27th, 2025, in New York, and I'm glad you're here, ready to drift into a gentle tale of history and human confidence. These days, whispers of unease echo through the American economy. Consumer confidence has slipped again in August, as high prices and a slowing job market stir anxiety. Only a modest number of jobs were added last month, while the unemployment rate has crept higher. At the same time, debates over the independence of the Federal Reserve have rattled investors, pushing them to seek shelter in safe haven assets. And even as Chair Jerome Powell carefully hints that a rate cut may come in September, markets remain restless, uncertain whether relief will truly arrive. In this climate, gold shines brighter not because it promises profit, but because it speaks to something deeper. Stability in a world where currencies and confidence are fleeting once. In the ancient world, gold was more than just metal. In times when emperors fell and empires fractured, people clutched at its unyielding weight, trusting that what glittered in their palms would outlast the shifting tides of power. In the late days of Rome, as debased coins lost their worth and soldiers demanded payment in something real, it was gold that preserved trust when governments could not. And here we are, centuries later, following the same instinct. The allure of gold persists not because it yields interest, not because it grows like a stock, but because it feels incorruptible, immune to decree or default. It is the anchor we turn to when the rest of the world feels like it is adrift. So tonight, as markets tremble and headlines stir unease, I invite you to wander with me down the golden corridors of history, to uncover why this ancient refuge continues to hold our faith. And perhaps, by the end, we will see that what glitters in the vaults of history still whispers to us in 2025, offering not just wealth, but something rarer still, hope. The story of gold is not simply the story of a precious metal, but rather the story of human vulnerability. Across centuries, whenever markets cracked, currencies collapsed, or empires trembled, people have turned instinctively toward gold, as if its glow could ward off uncertainty. This reflex, repeated from Babylon to Wall Street, reveals something profound about how we cope with fear. Gold is not eaten, nor planted, nor burned for warmth. Yet it is the one possession people cling to in famine, in inflation, in panic, and in war. Imagine the 14th century, when the Black Death thinned the populations of Europe, and coins of silver and copper lost their reliability. Merchants who once trusted the weight of minted crowns began to demand payments in raw bullion, because raw metal carried no ruler's promise, only its own. Or look to the 16th century, when galleons from the New World poured rivers of silver into Europe's markets, flooding kingdoms with currency that lost value as quickly as it arrived. Amid the confusion, gold remained rarer, harder to debase, and therefore prized as the honest measure of wealth. Even Philip II of Spain, drowning in debts from endless wars, still borrowed in terms of gold, for lenders would not accept promises in inflated silver. Fast forward to the 19th century, when America experienced panics that swept away banks like houses of cards. In 1837, when President Andrew Jackson's specie circular required land purchases to be made in gold or silver, confidence in paper collapsed. Crowds lined up outside shuttered banks, desperate to trade notes for coin. A century later, in the Great Depression, as banks fell one by one, Americans once again hoarded gold. So much so that the government outlawed private holdings in 1933, in an effort to restore control. Yet the instinct did not die, merely went underground, waiting for the next crisis. Even in our lifetimes, this pattern repeats. The 2008 financial crash sent investors fleeing into gold, lifting its price. As faith in mortgage-backed securities and banking giants disintegrated, in the pandemic year of 2020, when entire economies froze, gold once again became the refuge. reaching record highs as governments printed money at historic scales. Now, in 2025, as markets nervously parse every word from the Federal Reserve, and citizens feel their wages eroded by inflation, the same old instinct flickers alive. In digital age headlines, gold still plays the role it once played in the crumbling forums of Rome. But here is the question that lingers as the night grows still. Why? Why do humans, across cultures and centuries, choose gold rather than iron, or grain, or even the new fascination of cryptocurrency? Is it because gold resists rust and corrosion, shining the same after 1,000 years? Is it because its scarcity is natural, not dictated by parliaments or presidents? Or is it because, deep down, people crave something tangible, a reassurance that no decree, no signature, no algorithm can erase the weight in their hand? The overview of tonight's story, then, is not a simple tale of economics, but of psychology. We will wander through the Roman Empire, where emperors shaved silver from coins and citizens demanded payment in gold. We will travel to the Spanish Empire, swollen with silver, yet perpetually bankrupt, where only gold held its dignity. We will pause in the American panics of the 19th century, where farmers, merchants, and bankers alike measured survival in gold coins hidden beneath floorboards. And we will glimpse our own times, where the digital screens of Wall Street still quake at every tremor of trust. And yet the oldest refuge remains untouched, glittering in vaults and whispered about in coffee shops. Gold has never been just about wealth. It has been about trust, memory, and survival. To follow its journey is to understand why, in 2025, as headlines flicker with uncertainty, people once more run to it not merely for profit, but for the comfort of something that seems eternal. And as we unravel these stories, you may find that the history of gold is really the history of ourselves, anxious, hopeful, and forever reaching for something that endures. So, if you're still with me on this journey, take a moment to gently like this video, subscribe if you wish to hear more midnight tales of history, and perhaps leave a comment telling me whether you trust gold, or if your safe haven would be something else. After all, every story grows richer when told together. Our story begins in the marketplaces of the ancient world, long before Wall Street screens glowed with red numbers or central banks held press conferences. In Babylon and Egypt, where grain stored in silos was as valuable as life itself, merchants still yearned for something more permanent than crops, something immune to drought, to rot, and to the cruel scythe of time. They found it in gold. The Egyptians called it Nub, from which the land of Nubia drew its name, a place rich in the golden sands of the Nile's southern reaches. Gold was soft, malleable, and rare, yet it carried a luster that never faded, unlike copper that dulled or iron that rusted. Its very uselessness in practical terms made it perfect for trust. No one could eat it or forge a plow with it, but it dazzled in temples and on the necks of kings, signaling that here was wealth no famine could erase. By the time the Lit struck the first true coins in the 7th century BCE, mixing gold with silver into electrum stators, the psychology of trust in metal had been sealed. Citizens accepted stamped pieces not because of royal generosity, but because they believed the shine itself endured. Livy, in his Tales of Early Rome, notes how payment in precious metal carried a dignity that barter or cattle could not, binding a community together in trust of something beyond the whim of men. And though the Republic later shifted to silver denarii, gold always lurked as the ultimate store of value, reserved for the grandest exchanger's tributes to foreign kings, rewards to victorious generals, and the treasuries of temples that promised continuity across generations. This attachment to gold became painfully clear in times of upheaval. When Hannibal's armies thundered across Italy during the Second Punic War, farmers fled their fields, cities were sacked, and Roman finances bled Yet the Senate still hoarded its gold reserves, refusing to melt sacred treasures unless desperation demanded it. The reason was not mere superstition, it was a recognition that in the darkest hours, gold was the final line of trust, the last anchor that could secure loans or pay troops when all else collapsed. Centuries later, as the empire swelled, emperors repeatedly debased the silver coinage, cutting purity to pay for ever-growing legions. But gold aurii remained remarkably stable. Historia Augusta tells us that soldiers preferred their bonuses in gold, for they knew it held its worth when silver dwindled to base metal. Trust in emperors faltered. Trust in gold endured. And here, the echo to our own age grows loud. In 2025, as inflation lingers and central banks debate whether to cut rates or hold firm, ordinary people read headlines and quietly wonder, will my wages tomorrow buy what they buy today? Digital money can be printed in seconds. Promises of politicians can change in a news cycle. But gold, though it sits idle, seems to whisper of permanence. Just as a Roman farmer might have buried coins in an earthen jar to shield his family from uncertainty, so to do investors today buy gold bars, coins, or ETFs, not for growth, but for reassurance. In this way, the story of humanity's attachment to gold is not a story of greed, but of fear. It is about the longing for something that outlasts storms, the search for light when trust in men and markets runs thin. And as you listen now, perhaps with the faint glow of a screen nearby, you may realize that we are not so different from the people of antiquity. Our tools have changed, but our anxieties remain the same. When Rome finally crumbled in the West, the fall was not just of emperors and marble forms, it was also of money. The orderly flow of coins, the taxes that once paid legions, the certainty of a treasury measured in solid aurii, all dissolved into the fractured economies of medieval Europe. Gold, once the heartbeat of an empire, grew scarce. The mines of Spain and Gaul no longer yielded as before, and trade routes from the east withered under waves of invasion. For centuries, Western Europe lived in what historians call a silver economy, because gold was so rare that a single Byzantine coin, a solidus, might pass from hand to hand as a family treasure rather than an instrument of daily exchange. The Byzantines themselves, heirs of Rome in the east, guarded their gold coinage with jealous care. The solidus, later called the bezant, was struck with a purity that hardly wavered for centuries. Chroniclers like Gibbon admired its stability, calling it the most celebrated coin in history. Western merchants craved it, and pilgrims returning from Constantinople often carried a few as proof they had touched the wealth of the East. In contrast, the rulers of fractured Europe minted debased silver pennies, fragile in value, and often resented by peasants who saw prices shift with the whims of lords. It was this imbalance that set the stage for the Crusades. Beyond their religious banners, the expeditions eastward reopened the arteries of trade that had been closed for generations. Caravans once again carried spices, silks, and crucially gold. From the markets of Cairo and Damascus to the ports of Venice and Genoa, Italian bankers rose in this period, their ledgers stretching across the Mediterranean. But at the base of their wealth was always the same glowing anchor. When they wrote contracts, when they extended credit to kings, repayment was demanded in gold florins or ducats, not in fluctuating silver pennies. The Florentine florin, first struck in 1252, became a symbol of reliability, accepted from London to Constantinople, because its weight and purity rarely wavered. For ordinary people, gold was less about commerce and more about security. Chronicles tell of peasants who hid coins in wooden beams or beneath church altars, believing the sanctity of the holy ground would protect both soul and savings. In famine years, when grain was scarce and taxes high, a single gold coin could mean the difference between starvation and survival. It was not that peasants had much of it. They rarely did, but the idea of gold The dream of it lingered as the ultimate form of safety. Looking at this from our modern vantage point in 2025, the parallel is striking. Today, as headlines speak of fragile labor markets and the possibility of economic slowdown, we find ourselves in a world where digital currencies and speculative assets rise and fall like medieval silver pennies. Yet just as Venetian merchants insisted on gold ducats, modern investors quietly shift their portfolios into gold when uncertainty grows. The pattern has not changed. When trust is thin, gold is thick. What makes this fascinating is how little utility gold provides. It cannot build bridges or power factories. And yet, its very lack of industrial use preserved its mystique in the medieval mind. While iron rusted and silver tarnished, gold gleamed unchanged on altars and in crowns. It was seen as incorruptible, even divine, a symbol of permanence in an age where life was often short and brutal. That perception made it the natural store of hope, and hope, in many ways, is what people have always needed most in crisis. And so, through the long centuries of scarcity, gold remained the quiet hero of survival. In a Europe battered by plague, famine, and war, its glow reminded people that somewhere, beyond the chaos of daily life, something still endured. It was not just a metal, it was continuity itself. By the time Europe entered the Renaissance, the dream of gold burned brighter than ever. The memory of scarcity during the Middle Ages had left merchants and monarchs alike hungry for the promise of inexhaustible wealth. The voyages of Columbus, da Gama, and Magellan were not only quests for new lands or new souls to convert, they were, at their core, a feverish search for precious metals. Gold was seen as the key to power, the blood that could sustain empires and fuel armies in an age of exploration and conquest. Spain, flush with the discovery of the Americas, became the greatest stage for this golden obsession. Galleons sailed back across the Atlantic, heavy with bullion, unloading at Seville and Cadiz. Bars of silver and gold wrested from Mexico and Peru. The mountain of Potosi, in what is now Bolivia, became a symbol of both promise and curse. From its depths poured oceans of silver, and, to a lesser degree, veins of gold that dazzled Europe's markets. Chroniclers wrote of streets paved with coins, of monarchs weighed down not by crowns but by debts, for all this wealth, paradoxically, brought instability. Philip II of Spain, ruling at the height of this influx, found himself both richest and poorest of kings. His treasuries brimmed with bullion, yet his obligations to creditors in Genoa, Augsburg, and Antwerp drained the flow as quickly as it arrived. The irony, noted by historians like Geoffrey Parker, was that gold and silver, meant to secure the crown's supremacy, instead fueled a spiral of borrowing and default. The gold that glittered in Spanish coffers one month was pledged away in loans the next, to pay for wars in the Netherlands, armadas against England, and endless skirmishes across Europe. Merchants of Florence and Venice, by contrast, thrived. By managing this flood, they insisted on gold florins or ducats in their ledgers, stable currencies that endured even as silver slumped under the weight of oversupply. It was the resilience of gold, not the torrents of silver, that preserved the financial networks of the Renaissance. Bankers trusted gold because it resisted debasement, and because it had proven, through centuries of turmoil, to be the truest measure of wealth. For the ordinary citizen, the Renaissance gold rush was both a wonder and a curse. Prices soared. The famous price revolution of the 16th century saw the cost of bread and meat double and triple within a generation. Driven by the inflationary wave of silver, wages lagged, peasants struggled, and soldiers often found their pay devalued before they could spend it. In such a world, gold became not just a symbol of luxury, but a desperate hedge. Families that could acquire even a single gold coin held onto it as tightly as a relic. passing it down as the only assurance that their labor would not be swallowed by the tide of inflation. The echoes of this Renaissance story reach us clearly in 2025. Just as Spain learned that floods of money do not guarantee stability, modern economies have discovered that stimulus and liquidity, though essential in crisis, can ripple outward into price rises and new vulnerabilities. And just as merchants 400 years ago insisted on gold contracts to escape the risks of oversupplied silver, today's investors sometimes turn away from printed dollars, euros, or yen, and buy into gold when currencies seem unstable. The psychology is the same. Gold feels like truth in a world of shifting promises. What makes the Renaissance chapter so haunting is the duality of gold. It built empires and bankrupted them. It promised abundance, yet delivered inflation. It crowned kings and chained them to creditors. And through it all, the ordinary people, struggling under higher prices and uncertain futures, still dreamed of holding gold, believing it could protect them from the very storms it had helped unleash. Thus the Renaissance did not diminish the myth of gold. It amplified it. The failures of monarchs and the suffering of peasants alike confirmed that, in times of plenty or scarcity, in the courts of kings or the huts of farmers, the only true measure of safety was the same shimmering metal that had dazzled pharaohs and senators before them. By the 17th century, Europe's obsession with gold began to take on a more organized shape. The chaos of wars, the inflation of the 16th century, and the endless debts of monarchs had convinced merchants and thinkers alike that wealth needed a more disciplined anchor. Thus, the age of banks and the earliest whispers of a gold standard began to emerge. It was not enough that kings hoarded treasure in vaults. Stability demanded a system, one that could turn the sparkle of gold into the skeleton of modern finance. In Amsterdam, the establishment of the Bank of Amsterdam in 1609 marked a quiet revolution. Merchants wary of clipped coins and unstable silver turned to the bank's promise. Deposits would be backed by precious metals, especially gold, and transfers could be made by ledger without the hassle of weighing each coin. This was not a monarchy's whim, nor a soldier's demand, but a civic promise trust in gold, institutionalized. By the mid-17th century, Amsterdam had become Europe's financial heart, its reputation resting firmly on the perception that every florin in circulation was grounded in honest metal. Across the Channel, England's trajectory told a similar tale. The Glorious Revolution of 1688 and the rise of Parliament curtailed royal abuses. But money remained fragile. Wars against France drained the treasury, forcing the government to borrow on a scale never seen before. Out of this need was born the Bank of England in 1694, issuing notes that could be redeemed in gold. To the weary English merchant, this meant that even if the king defaulted, even if politics wavered, a promise in gold could be trusted. And slowly, paper money began to circulate, not as a dangerous experiment, but as a reflection of metal safely locked away. This shift was psychological as much as economic. For centuries, the belief had been that only rulers could sanctify money. But by the 18th century, trust was migrating toward institutions. And those institutions made their legitimacy not from crowns or armies, but from gold reserves. Montesquieu, Adam Smith, and the early political economists wrote of gold as the invisible ballast that steadied trade, kept prices honest, and restrained the excesses of reckless governments. In their eyes, it was gold that tamed ambition into order. The first experiments with something resembling a gold standard were clumsy, yet revealing. England, after periods of bimetallic confusion, leaned more firmly toward gold in the early 18th century, and by the 19th, it would adopt the standard outright. The principle was simple. No matter how much paper or coin was issued, it could always be exchanged for a fixed amount of gold. This promise gave the public something more potent than royal decrees gave them predictability. Ordinary citizens felt this shift in subtle ways. A London shopkeeper, once forced to weigh each coin to check for clipping, could now accept notes with more confidence. A sailor's widow could tuck away a gold guinea, knowing its worth would not vanish overnight. And farmers, when selling their produce, began to calculate prices, not in the silver pennies of their fathers, but in the golden stability promised by the new institutions. The comfort was psychological, almost spiritual. Even as wars raged and dynasties toppled, gold remained constant, binding together an age of expanding commerce. The echoes of this transition resonate deeply in America today. In 2025, as debates swirl about whether the Federal Reserve should cut rates, defend independence, or print more liquidity, ordinary people often ask a familiar question: what backs our money? Though dollars are no longer tied to gold, the very persistence of that question shows how deeply the memory of gold's discipline still lingers. Just as merchants of Amsterdam trusted ledgers only because they were backed by metal, so too do many modern investors remain skeptical of promises untethered from something tangible. Cryptocurrencies, for all their novelty, echo this yearning for scarcity, but gold, with millennia of history behind it, continues to command the deeper trust. Thus, the 17th and 18th centuries transformed the role of gold from a treasure locked in vaults into the foundation of modern finance. It became not just a symbol of wealth, but the architecture of trust. And in that transformation, humanity revealed once again its oldest instinct in times of uncertainty. Bind your faith not to men, nor to parchment, but to the eternal glow of gold. By the dawn of the 19th century, the fascination with gold had crystallized into something more rigid, the global gold standard. What had once been the private confidence of merchants or the careful pledges of banks was now elevated to the guiding principle of entire nations. Gold was no longer just a commodity, nor a luxury. It became the law of money. Governments across Europe, and eventually across the world, declared that every note, every coin, every promise issued by the state could be redeemed for a precise weight of gold. The age of kings had passed, yet their subjects inherited something far more enduring: the conviction that gold could govern value more faithfully than men. Britain led the way. After years of experimentation, it formally adopted the gold standard in 1821, fixing the pound sterling to a defined amount of gold. The effect was immediate and powerful. Trade expanded with new confidence because merchants in Calcutta, London, and New York could calculate their transactions with precision, knowing that pounds, rupees, and dollars had measurable equivalents in gold. Economists like Ricardo praised the system, calling it the invisible architecture of global commerce. For nearly a century, the gold standard imposed a kind of discipline not only on governments, but on human imagination. Inflation was restrained, deficits checked, and currencies tethered to something that could not be conjured with ink. And yet, beneath this stability lurked fragility. For gold was finite, while ambition was not. Nations that tied their fortunes to the metal found themselves bound by its scarcity. In times of growth, when new factories needed credit and new railroads demanded capital, the supply of gold often lagged, creating deflationary pressures. Farmers in America complained bitterly in the 1870s and 1890s that prices for wheat and corn fell not because of lack of demand, but because gold could not stretch enough to accommodate their labor. They dreamed of free silver to ease their burden, yet the gold standard held, defended fiercely by bankers and creditors who saw in it the shield of stability. The panics of 1857, 1873, and 1893 revealed the system's limits. Banks collapsed, credit dried up, and unemployment surged, all because gold reserves shrank or confidence wavered. In 1896, William Jennings Bryan thundered before a Democratic convention that mankind should not be crucified on a cross of gold. His words carried the pain of farmers and workers, who felt that the glitter of metal in vaults outweighed the hunger of men in fields. And yet, despite such protests, the gold standard endured. For elites and institutions believed that any alternative would unleash chaos. Meanwhile, the United States formally joined the system in 1879, redeeming dollars for gold at a fixed rate. This tether gave Wall Street credibility in the eyes of European investors, but it also meant that America, like Europe, was chained to the vagaries of mining output and international flows. When strikes in South African mines slowed production, or when wars consumed bullion, entire economies quivered. Stability and fragility, paradoxically, came hand in hand. Ordinary citizens felt this paradox keenly. In boom years, gold lent confidence. Shopkeepers trusted notes. Immigrants sent savings across oceans, and investors dreamed of perpetual progress. But in downturns, the very scarcity of gold worsened the pain. Families clung to coins as if to talismans, hiding them beneath floorboards, just as their ancestors had done centuries before. The psychology had not changed, only the scale. Now whole nations, not just households, depended on the glow of gold to survive crises. And here lies the bridge to our own age. In 2025, we no longer live under the gold standard. The dollar floats untethered from metal since 1971. Yet each time inflation erodes confidence. Each time central banks print liquidity. The same question emerges. Would life feel safer if every bill could once again be exchanged for gold? Though economists remind us of the rigidity and pain the gold standard inflicted, the yearning persists. It is the same yearning that haunted the 19th century farmer. The same hope that whispered in the vaults of London and New York. If only money were rooted in something eternal, perhaps our fears would ease. Thus the 19th century stands as both triumph and warning. Gold tamed nations, disciplined governments, and built an age of unprecedented global trade. But it also revealed the cruel irony that stability for the creditor could mean suffering for the debtor, that what glittered as order for elites could weigh as chains upon the poor. The gold standard was not just an economic system, it was a mirror, reflecting humanity's unending struggle to balance trust with freedom, certainty with compassion. And as the century closed, with the world marching toward the cataclysms of the 20th century, the lesson lingered. Gold could shine as guardian, but it could also cast shadows. If you're still listening at this point, let me know with a simple one in the comments to say, you're awake, or just type Z. If sleep has gently claimed you. And while you're here, don't forget to like this story. Subscribe for more golden tales of history, and share your thoughts below. Your voice makes these midnight journeys richer for us all. The 20th century dawned with gold, still enthroned as the master of money. The great powers, Britain, France, Germany, and the United States all pledged loyalty to the gold standard, confident it would guarantee stability in an age of railroads, telegraphs, and empire. At first glance, it seemed unshakable. Central banks locked bullion in their vaults. Currencies were pegged with precision, and merchants across oceans trusted that every pound or franc or dollar could be redeemed for its golden promise. Yet beneath this glittering facade, the modern world was preparing for storms that no metal, however eternal, could fully contain. The first test came with the outbreak of the First World War. In 1914, nations that had preached discipline suddenly found themselves desperate for survival. Mobilization required mountains of credit, and credit required breaking the chains of gold. Britain, France, and Germany suspended gold convertibility almost overnight, printing notes far in excess of their reserves. The gold standard, so proudly defended for nearly a century, was cast aside, not with debate, but with the silence of necessity. Gold did not disappear, was hoarded, hidden in vaults, clutched by citizens fearful of paper but had lost its role as everyday money. War had revealed the fragility of even the most trusted system. After the armistice, countries tried to restore the old order. In the 1920s, the so-called gold exchange standard attempted to revive stability, allowing nations to hold not only gold, but also dollars and pounds as reserves. At first, optimism ran high. Stock markets boomed, especially in New York, where skyscrapers glittered as symbols of prosperity. But the structure was brittle. The flow of gold was uneven, concentrated. In the United States, while debtor nations struggled to maintain parity, Germany, burdened by reparations, experienced catastrophic inflation in 1923 when it printed money without restraint. Paper marks lost all meaning, while gold coins and foreign currencies became lifelines. Photographs from Weimar show workers carting wages in wheelbarrows, only to trade them for a few eggs or loaves of bread. Yet those with access to gold-weather coins, jewelry, or hidden bars could still purchase what they needed. Trust in governments faltered. Trust in gold survived. The greatest collapse came with the Great Depression, when Wall Street crashed. In 1929, panic rippled across the globe. Banks failed, factories shuttered, and millions stood in breadlines. People rushed to exchange notes for gold, fearing paper might soon be worthless. The pressure was unbearable. By 1931, Britain abandoned the gold standard entirely, choosing economic flexibility over the burden of defending its currency. 2 years later, in 1933, President Franklin Roosevelt took an even bolder step. He suspended Americans' right to own gold. Citizens were required to turn in their coins and bars to the government, which fixed the dollar's value at $35 an ounce. It was a shocking act, justified as a necessity to stabilize the banking system. Gold, once the people's refuge, was now locked behind the walls of Fort Knox. Still, the symbolism endured. Even as Roosevelt declared that the dollar, not gold, would be the foundation of recovery, the government itself clung to the metal as its ultimate reserve. International trade and central bank settlements still turned on the weight of bullion. For ordinary Americans, the lesson was clear. In prosperity, the paper dollar was convenient, but in crisis, only gold could be trusted. Stories lingered of families hiding coins, or of rings and heirlooms sold quietly to pay debts when jobs vanished. Here in 2025, the memory of that age still lingers in the American psyche. Whenever headlines speak of fragile banks or rising unemployment, the shadow of the Great Depression hovers in the background. Investors, wary of repeating history, often turn to gold as if reenacting an old ritual of survival. And perhaps it is more than ritual, it is instinct. A reflex carved by generations who saw trust dissolve overnight and sought something they could hold in their hand. Thus, the early 20th century revealed both the power and the limits of gold. It anchored prosperity, yet it cracked under the weight of war and depression. It promised order, yet it demanded sacrifices that nations could no longer bear. And still, even as governments moved away from it, the people never truly let it go. Gold had become more than money, it had become memory, a collective reminder that, in the darkest nights, one gleam of permanence can steady the human heart. The Second World War shattered what little remained of the old monetary order. Gold, though still revered, had retreated into vaults, guarded as strategic treasure rather than circulating as money. Armies marched, cities burned, and governments once again suspended the discipline of convertibility to finance survival. In London, Churchill's ministers fretted over dwindling reserves. In Berlin, the Nazi regime looted gold from occupied nations, and even from individuals, sending trains of bullion to the Reichsbank. In Asia, Japan plundered coins and bars wherever its armies advanced. Gold had ceased to be ordinary money, yet it remained the ultimate prize of war, a metal that could be exchanged across borders. when paper currencies meant nothing. When peace finally arrived in 1945, the world faced not only physical ruin, but also financial chaos. Exchange rates were unstable, trade fractured, and inflation haunted countries still reeling from conflict. Into this vacuum stepped the United States, whose vaults at Fort Knox held 2/3 of the world's official gold reserves. America's industrial might and wartime loans had already positioned it as the creditor to the world. Now its golden hoard sealed its role as the new anchor of global finance. At Bretton Woods, a quiet New Hampshire resort, representatives from 44 nations gathered in July 1944 to design a new monetary system. The principle agreed upon was revolutionary yet familiar. The US dollar would be fixed to gold at $35 an ounce, and all other currencies would peg themselves to the dollar. In effect, gold remained the foundation, but the dollar became its visible face. John Maynard Keynes, representing Britain, pushed for a more flexible Bancor system. But the sheer weight of American gold and influence carried the day. For the next quarter century, the Bretton Woods system governed the world's money. European currencies rebuilt under the Marshall Plan, Japan's yen revived, and trade flourished under the assurance that dollars were as good as gold. Central banks held dollars in their reserves, confident that the U.S. Treasury stood ready to redeem them for bullion on demand. This arrangement created what historians call the gold-dollar symbiosis. Trust in American power was trust in gold, and vice versa. For ordinary people, the system was invisible, yet deeply felt. In the 1950s and 1960s, families in Paris, Tokyo, or New York could save in their local currency without fearing overnight collapse. Inflation was restrained, wages rose steadily, and consumer goods spread across middle-class homes. Behind this apparent prosperity, however, gold still glimmered in the background. Every paycheck, every mortgage, every savings account rested on the quiet promise that the dollar's value was ultimately tied to the eternal metal in Fort Knox. Yet, even in this golden age, tensions grew. The United States, burdened by cold, war commitments and the Vietnam War, began to spend far more than it could redeem. European allies, especially France under Charles de Gaulle, grew suspicious, demanding bullion in exchange for their swelling dollar reserves. Shipments of gold left New York for Paris, an eerie echo of ancient caravans where distrust in promises led men back to metal. Economists warned that the system could not last forever. The world was expanding, but America's gold reserves were. Not that the irony was striking. Gold, once again, both guaranteed stability and threatened it. The very faith that anchored global trade in the 1950s began to strain in the 1960s, as governments realized that too many claims were being written on too little bullion. The stage was set for a dramatic break, though in the tranquil suburbs of the West, few citizens realized the storm ahead. From our vantage point in 2025, the Bretton Woods years are remembered with nostalgia by some, a time of growth, order, and optimism. When the dollar was rock solid, and prosperity seemed endless, but the seeds of fragility were already sown. Just as in earlier centuries, the limits of gold's scarcity clashed with the boundless ambitions of nations, and once more, humanity would learn that even the strongest systems, built on the eternal glow of gold, could falter when trust outran reality. By the late 1960s, the cracks in the Bretton Woods system were no longer hairline. They were widening into fissures that could not be ignored. The United States, once the unquestioned guardian of global gold reserves, had overextended itself. The costs of the Vietnam War drained billions. Social programs at home, from Medicare to the Great Society, demanded more spending. Meanwhile, Europe and Japan had recovered spectacularly, exporting goods in exchange for dollars that piled up in their central banks. Those dollars, in theory, were all redeemable for gold, at $35. Foreign governments noticed. France, under Charles de Gaulle, famously sent warships to New York Harbor in 1965 to retrieve gold for its dollar holdings. Other nations followed quietly, redeeming paper for metal. Fort Knox's once towering reserves began to shrink. Confidence, the fragile essence of any monetary system, wavered. The world had built its post-war prosperity on the assumption that the United States could keep its pledge. Now that assumption was unraveling. The breaking point arrived on August 15, 1971, in a televised address that stunned the world. President Richard Nixon announced that the U.S. would temporarily suspend the dollar's convertibility into gold. In practice, this meant the end of Bretton Woods and the collapse of the last tie between ordinary money and the shimmering metal. The dollar, once as good as gold, became fiat currency, valuable only because the government declared it. So, and because people chose to believe it. Economists later called this the Nixon shock. But at the time it was less a shock than a recognition that the system had reached its limits. The consequences rippled swiftly. Exchange rates floated, sometimes violently. Inflation surged in the 1970s, fueled by oil shocks and monetary expansion. Americans who remembered the steady dollars of the 1950s now watched prices climb monthly. Their savings eroded in real time. The dollar endured as the world's reserve currency, not because it was tied to gold, but because no other nation could replace America's economic and military dominance. Gold itself, freed from its official anchor, soared in price climbing, from $35 an ounce to over $800 by 1980. Investors who had clung to the metal found themselves vindicated, while those who trusted paper alone often felt betrayed. For ordinary people, the shift was deeply unsettling. Generations had grown up believing that money represented something tangible, something eternal. Suddenly, that comfort was gone. A paycheck was no longer a claim on gold, it was only a piece of paper, whose value could shrink with every policy decision in Washington. Small wonder that in the decade after 1971, gold jewelry, coins, and bars became both investments and symbols of resistance to uncertainty. Families tucked away Krugerrands, or us eagles, as if reviving the instincts of Roman farmers, burying orei in clay jars. Historians today often note that the move to fiat money was inevitable. The global economy had grown too vast for gold's scarcity to govern it. Trade needed flexibility, and governments needed tools to fight recessions. Yet, the psychological cost was profound. Humanity had once more cut itself loose from the anchor of permanence, trusting instead in promises and policy. And each time inflation surged, each time crises loomed, the old yearning for gold resurfaced, just as it does now, in 2025, when high prices and fragile job markets remind Americans of the 1970s. The Nixon shock, then, was not just a financial event. It was a turning point in collective memory, the moment when people realized that trust in money was no longer tied to a tangible gleam, but to faith in governments and central banks. And as history shows, that kind of faith can be as fragile as paper. The decade after the Nixon shock was one of turbulence, unlike anything Americans had seen in generations. When the dollar was cut loose from gold in 1971, many hoped that the newfound flexibility would grant governments the ability to manage the economy more smoothly. Instead, the 1970s delivered a relentless storm of inflation, stagnation, and oil. Shocks that made citizens question whether money itself had lost its anchor. In 1973, the Yom Kippur War triggered an embargo by OPEC, sending oil prices quadrupling almost overnight. The cost of gasoline soared. Long lines formed at American gas stations, and the word stagflation entered the vocabulary, an ugly blend of stagnation and inflation. Workers found their paychecks shrinking in real terms, while retirees on fixed incomes felt betrayed by a system that no longer preserved the value of their savings. The once steady dollar seemed to dissolve in people's hands. Gold, meanwhile, thrived in chaos. Freed from its fixed price of $35 an ounce, it became a barometer of distrust. Investors, housewives, and even ordinary workers sought refuge in coins and bars, believing that if paper could no longer be trusted, gold would not fail them. By 1979, amid another oil shock triggered by the Iranian Revolution, inflation in the United States hit double digits. Gold's price surged in tandem, reaching a dazzling peak of more than $800 an ounce in January 1980. Newspapers declared a gold fever, and jewelry shops reported shortages as people converted cash into anything golden they could hold. For a brief, glittering moment, the metal seemed to reclaim its throne as the world's true money. But history is rarely kind to extremes. As inflation raged, a tall, bespectacled figure took the helm of the U.S. Federal Reserve, Paul Volcker. With a stoic calm that belied the storm around him, Volcker embarked on one of the most dramatic monetary tightening campaigns in history. Interest rates were pushed above 20%, crushing inflation, but also plunging the economy into recession. Farmers marched on Washington with tractors, homeowners wept as mortgage payments tripled, and unemployment climbed painfully. Yet Volcker held firm, believing that only by restoring faith in the dollar could stability return. The gamble worked. By the mid-1980s, inflation had collapsed, the dollar regained credibility, and gold's dramatic rise faded. Its price fell sharply from its 1980 peak, leaving latecomers who had bought at the top nursing heavy losses. Once again, gold had revealed its dual nature: savior in crisis, but cruel when fear subsides. Economists noted that while gold protects in panic, it offers no steady yield, no dividends. To hold it was to cling to security, but also to sacrifice growth when trust in paper returned. For ordinary people, the roller coaster of the 1970s and early 1980s left deep scars. They learned how fragile the value of money could be, how inflation could quietly rob them as effectively as a thief in the night. They also learned that governments could wrestle inflation back under control, but only at great cost. And above all, they learned that gold, while no longer official money, remained the emotional refuge when uncertainty spread. Even today in 2025, echoes of that era resurface whenever inflation creeps higher. Older generations remember lining up at gas stations, watching gold climb, and wondering if the system itself was broken. The story of those years is not only about metal or markets, but about psychology. Gold surged not simply because of supply and demand, but because of fear that wages would evaporate, that savings would dissolve, that the dollar would never again be trustworthy. And when fear subsided, when Volcker's iron discipline restored confidence, gold sank, almost in disappointment. It was as if the metal itself thrives only when faith in governments falters. Thus the 1970s and early 1980s revealed the rhythm of modern gold. It rises with anxiety, it falls with trust. It does not create prosperity, but it shelters hope in storms. And as the world turned toward the more optimistic years of the late 20th century, gold retreated into the background, waiting silently for the next tremor that would send humanity rushing back to its glow. As the 1980s progressed into the 1990s, the glow of gold dimmed after the feverish heights of 1980, when an ounce touched more than $800. The subsequent decades seemed almost like a long, languid exhale. Inflation had been crushed, the dollar restored, and the world entered a period of extraordinary confidence. Gold, once the centerpiece of panic, faded into the background, dismissed by many as a relic of the past. Paul Volcker's war on inflation had left scars, but it also left a legacy of credibility. When Alan Greenspan succeeded him at the Federal Reserve, The American economy entered what many called the Great Moderation. Growth was steady, inflation remained low, and interest rates declined in a rhythm that felt almost soothing. Wall Street thrived. Stock markets soared to record highs, fueled by globalization, new technologies, and the optimism of a world seemingly beyond crisis. For a generation that had lined up at gas stations in the 1970s, this calm felt miraculous. Gold, by contrast, languished. Prices drifted downward through the 1980s and into the 1990s, sometimes slipping below $300 an ounce. Investors who had clung to their coins in 1980 now muttered that the metal had betrayed them. Financial commentators declared it obsolete, a barbarous relic, in Keynes's old phrase. Irrelevant in a world where central banks appeared competent and markets endlessly inventive. Governments even sold their reserves. In the late 1990s, Britain infamously auctioned off nearly half its gold holdings at what later proved to be historic lows. To many, the verdict was clear. The age of gold was over. Yet beneath this complacency, history was only pausing. While Americans flocked to dot-com stocks and Europeans prepared for the launch of the euro, gold lay dormant, like a dragon asleep on its hoard, waiting for the tremors that would surely return. Those who studied longer cycles of history knew better than to dismiss it. They remembered that gold thrives not in stability, but in doubt, and stability is always more fragile than it appears. For ordinary people in the 1980s and 1990s, gold became less of an investment and more of a memory. Families kept jewelry and heirlooms, but few bought coins or bars. Savings accounts paid interest, stock portfolios grew, and the dollar itself felt like the ultimate safe haven. The lessons of the 1970s, though not forgotten, seemed distant, almost irrelevant to a world where computers shrank to desktops, Berlin's Wall crumbled, and prosperity seemed to stretch infinitely into the future. The irony, of course, is that this was the very illusion gold has always thrived upon. Each time humanity declares gold dead, a new crisis eventually proves otherwise. In the 1990s, few could imagine that within a decade, terrorist attacks, wars, and financial collapses would send gold soaring once more. But for the moment, the world indulged in the dream that paper and policy alone could carry trust. Looking back from 2025, that dream feels both understandable and naive. The post-Cold War world radiated optimism, and the dollar's strength overshadowed the ancient luster of gold. Yet in hindsight, the dormancy of gold was not death, it was patience. It was a reminder that markets, like empires, move in cycles, and that fear, once absent, always returns. Thus the 1980s and 1990s closed with gold, quiet, neglected, even mocked. But history's silence is often deceptive. Beneath the calm surface, the stage was already being set for the crises of the new millennium, when once again, as predictably as night follows day, humanity would rediscover its oldest refuge. And so part 2 ends here, with gold in retreat, the dollar triumphant, and a world dreaming of endless prosperity. But we know how quickly dreams can shatter. If you're still listening, perhaps give this tale a gentle like, and subscribe if you'd like to follow gold's journey into the storms ahead. Leave a 1 in the comments if you're awake with me, or a simple Z if sleep has already claimed you. Together, we'll continue into part 3, where the illusions of the 1990s give way to the shocks of the 21st century. The new millennium began not with calm, but with tremors. The optimism of the 1990s, when stock charts seemed to rise endlessly and globalization promised prosperity without borders, was swiftly pierced by reality. The bursting of the dot-com bubble in 2000 wiped away trillions in paper wealth. Investors who had once believed the internet would mint fortunes, overnight now saw portfolios vanish as quickly as they had swelled. It was a sobering reminder that paper promises, whether stock certificates or central banknotes, could dissolve in an instant. Then came September 11th, 2001. The attacks on New York and Washington sent shockwaves far beyond the lives so tragically lost. Markets froze, airlines collapsed, and for days after, Wall Street itself was shuttered beneath dust and grief. In those fearful hours, as trust in the permanence of towers and systems faltered, gold quietly rose. It was not a surge born of greed, but of instinct. Fear pushed people toward what felt incorruptible, a metal that could not be brought down by hijacked planes or collapsing skyscrapers. The years that followed deepened the sense of uncertainty. Wars in Afghanistan and Iraq drained American coffers, while the Federal Reserve, under Alan Greenspan and later Ben Bernanke, kept interest rates low to cushion the economy. Cheap money flowed into housing and financial markets, inflating bubbles that seemed stable at the time but were quietly laying kindling for the next great crisis. Meanwhile, deficits mounted, and whispers spread about whether the United States could sustain both its wars abroad and its promises at home. Through it all, gold climbed slowly but steadily, as if sensing that the world's newfound confidence in digital money and complex derivatives was more fragile than it appeared. By 2006, housing prices in America reached surreal heights. Families who could barely afford a modest income signed mortgages for homes that seemed to grow in value simply by existing. Wall Street packaged these loans into securities that earned the misleading label of safe. But gold, in its patient way, reflected the unease beneath the surface. From lows of around $250 an ounce in 1999, it marched past $600 by the mid-2000s. A quiet signal that fear was stirring again in the human heart. For ordinary people, these years were confusing. On the one hand, they enjoyed the fruits of easy credit bigger homes, rising stock markets, and cheap consumer goods from abroad. On the other, they remembered the lessons of parents and grandparents who had lived through inflation, depression, and war. Many quietly bought gold coins or jewelry, not to get rich but to keep something safe, just in case the dream unraveled. It was an old instinct, reawakened by new uncertainties. From our vantage point in 2025, the early 2000s looked like the prologue to Crisis. The twin shocks of terrorism and speculative bubbles revealed how fragile the world could be, even at the height of apparent prosperity. And each time fear flickered, gold was there, silent, patient, unchanging. Like a lighthouse waiting for storms, the stage was set for the great unraveling of 2008, when the illusion of stability finally collapsed, and gold, once mocked as dead, would surge back to the center of global attention. The year 2008 will forever be remembered as the moment when the modern financial system revealed just how fragile it truly was. What had begun as murmurs of trouble in the American housing market swelled into a tidal wave that swept across the globe, toppling banks, governments, and confidence alike. The collapse of Lehman Brothers in September, a venerable institution that had survived the Civil War and 2 world wars, was the thunderclap that announced the storm. Overnight, credit froze. Banks no longer trusted one another. Companies could not roll over their debts. Ordinary people, watching the news in disbelief, began to wonder whether the very foundations of prosperity had been an illusion. As panic spread, governments rushed to intervene. The U.S. Federal Reserve slashed interest rates to near zero, flooding markets with liquidity. Washington passed emergency bailouts, rescuing banks that had been deemed too big to fail. In Europe, governments nationalized financial institutions, while in Asia, export-driven economies reeled as global demand collapsed. Unemployment surged, foreclosures multiplied, and the phrase Great Recession entered the lexicon. For millions of families, the trauma was deeply personal. Lost jobs, lost homes, and savings wiped out in market turmoil. And through it all, gold gleamed brighter. Investors who had once sneered at the barbarous relic now fled to it as a safe haven. In the year before Lehman fell, gold hovered near $650 an ounce. By 2011, amid ongoing fears of recession and sovereign debt crises in Europe, it soared above $1,900, its highest level in history at the time. The surge was not driven by industrial demand or fashion. It was driven by fear. Fear that the trillions in newly printed dollars and euros would ignite inflation. Fear that banks could fail again. Fear that the very idea of money had lost its meaning. Gold became, once more, the metal of trust when institutions betrayed it. The psychology was ancient. Just as Romans once demanded pay in gold aurei when silver coins were debased, and just as Weimar Germans clung to foreign gold coins during hyperinflation, modern investors turned instinctively to bullion. Coin shops reported shortages. Families who had never thought about precious metals before quietly bought small bars or jewelry as insurance. For them, gold was not an investment strategy, but a lifeboat. If everything else sank, perhaps the golden raft would still float. What made the crisis even more poignant was the contrast between government's promises and the public's fears. Leaders insisted that bailouts and stimulus packages would stabilize the system. Central bankers argued that printing money was necessary to prevent collapse. And indeed, inflation did not immediately surge. In fact, deflation haunted economies for years after 2008. But people remembered history. They remembered the 1970s, the Great Depression, and stories whispered by grandparents. They knew that trust is slow to return once broken. So even as stock markets eventually recovered, faith remained fragile. Gold, heavy and silent, seemed to embody the caution that words and policies could not restore. For ordinary Americans, the lesson of 2008 was searing. The institutions they had believed unshakable could fall in a weekend. Banks could collapse. Jobs could vanish, and homes could be taken away, all while politicians argued. Against such uncertainty, gold offered no dividends, no interest, no guarantees of wealth, but it did offer permanence. And in times of fear, permanence is priceless. From the vantage point of 2025, the memory of that golden surge still lingers. Each time markets wobble today, analysts invoke 2008 as a warning, and gold as the old refuge. The metal's ascent during those years was not just about economics, it was about psychology, about the human need to grasp something that feels immune to betrayal. And just as it had for millennia, gold answered that need, silently, without promise, without deception. Simply by being. The 2008 crisis revealed that gold's role is not to fuel prosperity, but to preserve sanity. It shines brightest when everything else grows dark. The years after 2008 were marked not by recovery in the old sense, but by experimentation. Central banks, shaken by how close the system had come to collapse, embarked on policies never before tried at such scale. Quantitative easing QE, as it became known, saw the Federal Reserve, the European Central Bank, and the Bank of Japan create trillions of dollars, euros, and yen to buy bonds, steady markets, and pump life into economies still gasping for air. For policymakers, this was a bold innovation. For ordinary citizens, it was something more unsettling, proof that money itself could be summoned from nothing, conjured by keystrokes on a central banker's screen. At first, the immediate threat was not inflation, but austerity. In Europe, sovereign debt crises erupted as Greece, Spain, Portugal, and Italy struggled to meet obligations. Newspapers filled with images of Greek pensioners lining up outside shuttered banks, unable to withdraw their savings. Protesters filled the streets of Athens, their banners declaring that their futures had been stolen. Bonds were downgraded, governments toppled, and yet amid the turmoil, gold once again became the measure of fear. Investors doubted whether the euro could survive. They did not doubt the permanence of an ounce of gold. From 2010 to 2012, as debates raged over bailouts and defaults, gold surged, crossing the historic $1,900 mark in September 2011. In times of uncertainty, the pattern repeated itself with almost ritual precision. When citizens saw their governments promise cuts, or their central banks announce new waves of money creation, they instinctively turned to metal. Coin dealers reported record demand, advertisements for gold-filled television screens. For many, it was less about profit than about trust. If euros could be devalued, if banks could close without warning, then surely a gold coin in hand was the one certainty left. Yet as the decade wore on, something strange happened. The apocalyptic fears of runaway inflation never fully materialized. Instead, economies stabilized slowly, unevenly, but undeniably. Markets rebounded, unemployment fell, and the stock indices of New York, London, and Tokyo climbed to new heights. As confidence returned, gold slipped from its peak. By 2013, prices began to fall, eventually settling far below their 2011 highs. Commentators once again dismissed the metal as overhyped, an emotional refuge that had outlived its usefulness. But this dismissal missed the deeper truth. Gold had not failed. It had done exactly what it always does. It had risen when fear reigned, offering shelter during storms. And as calm returned, it retreated, not because it was worthless, but because people no longer needed its comfort. The cycle was as old as history itself. Fear drives us to gold. Confidence draws us away. For ordinary people, the 2010s left a paradoxical lesson. On the one hand, they saw that governments could print extraordinary sums without immediate collapse. On the other, they never quite shook the suspicion that someday the reckoning might come. Gold remained the quiet insurance, tucked away in safes and jewelry boxes, bought not for yield, but for peace of mind. When banks spoke of unlimited liquidity, many quietly thought of their grandparents who had hidden coins beneath floorboards, and they understood why. Looking back from 2025, the 2010s feel like a rehearsal for our own moment. Policymakers insisted that they had mastered the art of money creation, that stability could be engineered. Yet beneath the statistics, gold's steady hum reminded us that trust is fragile and history is never erased. Every ounce held in vaults, or hands was a whisper from the past. Remember, the promises of paper endure only as long as belief does. Thus, the post-crisis decade revealed once again the essential truth of gold. It is not about return, but about refuge. In a world where money could be printed without limit, the finite weight of gold felt like an anchor, silent, immovable. Eternal. The year 2020 arrived, with little warning of the storm it would bring. By February, whispers of a new virus spreading from Wuhan reached American shores. By March, the whispers had become sirens. Lockdowns swept across continents. Borders closed, and entire economies ground to a halt. Restaurants shuttered, flights vanished from the sky, and the hum of modern life dissolved into eerie silence. Stock markets plunged in their steepest falls since 1929, erasing trillions in wealth within weeks. Fear was not confined to investors. It spread into every home, carried on headlines about ventilators, rising death tolls, and hospitals stretched to breaking. In that atmosphere of collective panic, governments reached once more for the printing press. But this time it was not merely to stabilize banks, it was to keep entire societies afloat. The United States unleashed stimulus checks, forgivable loans, and emergency benefits on a scale never attempted before. The Federal Reserve expanded its balance sheet by trillions in months, promising unlimited liquidity. Across Europe, Asia, and Latin America, central banks followed suit, conjuring money faster than in any previous crisis. For the first time, Ordinary citizens saw the mechanics of fiat money laid bare. Money was no longer mined, or even borrowed. It was created, and in the shadows of this upheaval, gold rose again. By August 2020, amid the uncertainty of the pandemic's second wave, the price of gold surged past $2,050 an ounce, the highest level in history. It was not simply investors chasing returns. It was a global sigh of instinct. When the world feels like it is collapsing, hold something permanent. Families bought coins, governments strengthened reserves, and headlines spoke of a new rush to gold. For many, it was Dacia Vutha, same pattern seen in 2008. In the 1970s, and countless crises before, yet the pandemic also introduced something new. Competition for gold's role as safe haven. Cryptocurrencies, especially Bitcoin, began to gain mainstream attention as a digital gold. Its scarcity, hardwired by algorithm, appealed to those who saw central banks' money creation as reckless. Some younger investors chose Bitcoin over bullion, believing it the modern refuge. Still, the oldest instincts endured. When fear peaked, gold's price spoke louder than any theory. It remained the universal anchor, accepted in every culture, every era. For ordinary people, 2020 was less about markets than about survival. Parents struggled to homeschool children. Workers lost jobs overnight, and millions faced eviction or hunger. In such times, the gleam of gold was less about profit than about reassurance. A coin, a ring, a bar hidden away it, whispered that, no matter what storms raged outside, something eternal could still be held in hand. Just as peasants in the Middle Ages had buried florins beneath church altars, or Americans in the Great Depression had hoarded coins in jars. Families in 2020 quietly turned to gold as a private ritual of security. Looking back from 2025, the pandemic years feel surreal, a time when the world stood still, yet money flowed in torrents unseen before. Stock markets rebounded, but so too did inequality and distrust. Gold's surge in 2020 was not just about price charts, it was about memory. It reminded us that when trust is shaken, whether by virus, by government decree, or by sheer uncertainty, people reach for the same ancient refuge they always have. Thus, the pandemic did not so much change gold's role as reaffirm it. In the silence of empty streets and the glow of endless screens, humanity rediscovered the comfort of permanence. Gold, unyielding and incorruptible, proved once again that in crises, both ancient and modern, the shimmer of trust never truly fades. The world that emerged from the pandemic was restless, uncertain, and haunted by the shadows of choices made in desperation. Trillions of dollars, euros, and yen had been created to keep households afloat and markets stable. But once the immediate crisis faded, another specter rose: inflation. By 2021 and 2022, prices surged across the globe. Groceries, gasoline, rents, and mortgages all climbed, leaving families bewildered. The same governments that had handed out lifelines now struggled to explain why wages lagged behind and why everyday life seemed suddenly more expensive. In the United States, inflation reached levels not seen in 4 decades. The Federal Reserve, which had long reassured the public that rising prices were transitory, was forced to reverse course, hiking interest rates at the fastest pace since the 1980s. For borrowers, it was a rude awakening. Mortgages doubled, credit cards bit harder, and companies slowed hiring. Yet even as the Fed tried to restore trust with stern measures, uncertainty lingered. Investors and ordinary citizens alike turned once more to the ancient comfort of gold. At the same time, geopolitics added fuel to the fire. Russia's invasion of Ukraine in 2022 rattled markets, sending energy prices higher and reawakening fears of global conflict. Sanctions froze hundreds of billions in Russian reserves, reminding nations that fiat money, unlike gold, could be politicized, seized with the stroke of a pen. China, too, watched closely, accelerating its quiet purchases of bullion. Central banks around the world, from Turkey to India to Poland, bought gold at record levels, diversifying away from the dollar, not because it was weak, but because they feared the fragility of trust in a world where power was shifting. For ordinary people, these grand strategies played out in smaller, sharper ways. Families noticed how quickly groceries devoured their paychecks. Renters discovered that transitory inflation meant permanent struggles. Retirees watched savings erode, remembering their parents' stories of the 1970s. And amid this unease, gold jewelry, coins and bars once again became household discussion. It wasn't about getting rich. It was about keeping something safe about, knowing that when paper feels flimsy and promises uncertain, 1 ounce of gold still gleams the same as it did 1,000 years ago. By 2023 and 2024, as rate hikes slowed and inflation cooled, some commentators once again declared gold obsolete. They pointed to booming tech stocks, to cryptocurrencies, to the resilience of the dollar. But then fresh anxieties appeared. Debates over the independence of the Federal Reserve, questions about America's fiscal sustainability, political polarization that shook faith in stability itself. Each headline, each tremor, seemed to nudge investors back toward gold. Prices hovered near record highs, not because of frenzy, but because of a slow, steady erosion of certainty. Now, in 2025, we live in a world eerily familiar in its contradictions. The economy grows, yet many feel poorer. Technology dazzles, yet insecurity deepens. Governments promise stability, yet trust feels thin. And once again, gold stands quietly at the crossroads, not the engine of prosperity, but the refuge of doubt. It has no ideology, no party, no nation. It endures. The lesson of the early 2020s is the same as it was in Rome, in Renaissance Spain, in Depression-era America. When fear rises, so does gold. It is not magic, it is not progress. It is memory, condensed into metal, passed from one anxious generation to the next. And so Part 3 closes with gold, very much alive, gleaming in vaults, clutched in hands, and lingering in the dreams of a public that knows, deep down, that trust is fragile. If you've made it with me this far, perhaps leave a 1 in the comments to let me know you're awake. Or a Z if this golden lullaby has carried you towards sleep. And of course, a like or a gentle subscribe helps us keep wandering together through history's midnight corridors. Long before Wall Street flickered with screens or the Roman Senate debated coinage, gold already held a sacred place in the imagination of civilizations far older. To step into the tombs of Egypt, the temples of India, or the palaces of China, is to understand that the metal story is not merely economic, it is spiritual, cultural, and eternal. These societies did not simply use gold as money. They revered it as a bridge between mortal life and something that endures beyond time. In Egypt, gold was the flesh of the gods. The Nile's kingdom, bathed in sunlight, saw in its gleam the very radiance of Ra, the sun god. Pharaohs demanded that their burial masks, like the famous visage of Tutankhamun, be hammered from pure gold. It was not wealth in the modern sense. It was permanence. When the body decayed, when dynasties fell, the golden mask remained uncorrupted, a testimony that the soul, like the metal, could not be tarnished. In temples, priests offered golden statues as vessels for divine presence, confident that the gods favored the metal that never rusted, never faded. To hold gold in Egypt was not merely to possess value, it was to touch eternity. Far to the east, in India, gold became interwoven with daily life in a different but equally enduring way. Ancient texts, like the Rig Veda, speak of Hiranya, the golden womb from which the universe itself was born. Gold was not only sacred, it was auspicious. Even today, families in India buy gold jewelry at festivals and weddings, not only as adornment, but as protection. The custom stretches back thousands of years, when dynasties hoarded gold coins stamped with deities, and merchants carried it along the Silk Roads. To an Indian family, gold was, and remains more than wealthy. It is a guardian spirit, passed through generations, carried into marriage, given at birth, and offered in rituals to gods and ancestors alike. In China, too, gold was prized, though its role was often more symbolic than monetary. The great dynasties minted copper coins for circulation, but emperors reserved gold as tribute, as imperial treasure, and as a symbol of heavenly mandate. The dragon throne gleamed with gilded ornaments, and golden ingots, known as saisi, served as stores of wealth and as ritual offerings. In Taoist alchemy, gold represented immortality, a substance so pure that it defied corruption. Philosophers believed that to ingest or align with its essence was to draw closer to eternal life. Even today, Chinese festivals celebrate gold as a harbinger of prosperity. Shops fill with golden charms, not for investment alone, but for the comfort of continuity. What ties these cultures together is not economics, but psychology. Whether in the deserts of Egypt, the temples of India, or the courts of China, people turn to gold because it seemed to capture the one thing humans fear losing most: permanence. Crops wither, dynasties crumble, and paper burns, but gold endures. Its incorruptibility made it divine, its beauty made it desirable, and its scarcity made it precious. And here, in 2025, the echoes remain unmistakable. When modern Americans buy gold coins, or when investors debate its price, they are participating in the same ritual once practiced by pharaohs and merchants millennia ago. The motivations may be framed in financial jargon: hedges, inflation protection, portfolio diversification, but the instinct is the same. It is the yearning for something untouchable, something immune to the decay of time and the betrayals of politics. Thus, as we move through these ancient civilizations, we see that gold was never only money, it was memory, it was faith hammered into metal. And its power lay not merely in markets, but in the human soul's need to believe that anything might last forever. Across the Atlantic, in the high valleys of the Andes and the sprawling cities of Mesoamerica, gold gleamed with meanings both sacred and tragic. For the civilizations of the Aztec and the Inca, it was not merely a metal to be hoarded, but a divine substance, a gift of the gods, woven into rituals that bound heaven and earth. Yet, when Europeans arrived, that same sacred glow became a beacon that lured conquest, greed, and catastrophe. For the Aztec, who built their empire upon the lakes of central Mexico, gold was the sweat of the sun. They believed that the sun god, Huitzilopochtli, demanded offerings of both blood and brilliance. Temples glimmered with golden ornaments, masks, and jewelry, not for vanity, but for cosmic balance. To adorn an idol in gold was to strengthen its power, to keep the sun rising each morning. Chroniclers like Bernal Diaz, who marched with Hernan Cortes, wrote with astonishment of the riches he saw in Tenochtitlan, the dazzling walls of the great temple, studded with golden discs that reflected the sunlight in blinding brilliance. To the Spaniards, this was treasure. To the Aztec, it was faith made tangible. In the high Andes, the Inca shared a similar reverence. To them, gold was the tears of Inti, the sun god, who shone down upon the empire from the sky. Temples, such as the Coricancha in Cusco, the very heart of the Inca world, were covered in sheets of hammered gold, designed to blaze like the dawn itself when the sun struck its walls. Priests performed rituals in golden vessels, and the emperor, the Sapa Inca, was clothed in ornaments that proclaimed him the living child of the sun. In the Andean worldview, gold was not a medium of exchange, was too sacred to be ordinary money. It was the divine material that linked humans to their celestial parent. Then came the Spanish. To the conquistadors, steeped in Renaissance Europe, hunger for bullion, these temples and ornaments were not symbols of eternity, but prizes of conquest. When Cortez toppled Tenochtitlan in 1521, gold was stripped from idols, melted into bars, and shipped across the Atlantic. When Francisco Pizarro seized Atahualpa, the last emperor of the Inca, he demanded a ransom of rooms filled with gold and silver. A ransom so vast it staggered even European imaginations. Chroniclers tell us that Atahualpa's ransom alone equaled more treasure than Spain had seen in a century yet after receiving it. The conquistadors executed him anyway. The tragedy was not only the violence, but the clash of meanings. To the Aztec and Inca, gold had been sacred, a connection to the gods, never meant for mere trade. To the Spaniards, gold was currency, debt payment, and power in European wars. In the fire of conquest, the sacred was reduced to ingots, its divine significance obliterated in the furnaces of empire. And yet, even in this devastation, the old instincts flickered. Spanish kings, drowning in the wealth of the New World, spent it as quickly as it arrived, funding wars, paying creditors, and fueling the inflation that historians now call the price revolution. Gold that had once served as the skin of gods in Mexico or the tears of the sun in Peru now destabilized Europe, flooding markets, raising prices, and straining economies. The very metal that had been divine in the Americas became, in Europe, both a blessing and a curse. For ordinary people of the New World, the conquest was a wound that never healed. Families saw sacred ornaments stripped from temples, their gods defiled, and their emperors dethroned. For them, gold ceased to be the eternal symbol of the cosmos, and became instead the marker of their dispossession. Looking back from 2025, we see in this story a haunting lesson. Gold carries whatever meaning we place upon it. To some, it is sacred. To others, it is currency. To others still, it is security. But it always provokes desire. And when desire burns unchecked, whether in the hands of conquistadors or in the speculation of markets, it can bring not only refuge but ruin. Thus, the saga of the Aztec and Inca reminds us that gold is never neutral. It reflects humanity's highest hopes and darkest hungers. And in its glow we see both the brilliance of faith and the shadow of conquest. If the Americas dazzled Europe with sudden torrents of gold and silver, West Africa had long been a land where the metal seemed to flow as naturally as the great rivers that carved its plains. Long before Spanish galleons crossed the Atlantic, the kingdoms of Ghana, Mali, and Songhai held reputations that traveled across deserts and oceans. To the Arab world and later to Europe, these lands were whispered of as Eldorados, not myth, but real realms where gold dust was measured by handfuls and entire cities gleamed with wealth. The kingdom of Ghana, flourishing from the 8th to the 11th centuries, was one of the first to earn fame as the land of gold. Arab traders crossing the Sahara in camel caravans brought salt and cloth, exchanging them for nuggets and dust that miners collected from the rivers of West Africa. Chroniclers described how the king of Ghana sat in splendor, adorned with gold ornaments, his court dazzling visitors, who had never before seen such abundance. For the people of Ghana, gold was not merely a commodity. It was prestige, power, and a visible reminder that their land lay at the crossroads of trade that stretched from North Africa to the Mediterranean. But it was Mali, rising in the 13th century, that carved gold's legend most indelibly into human memory. Its most famous ruler, Mansa Musa, undertook a pilgrimage to Mecca in 1324 that shook the very economy of the medieval world, traveling with a caravan said to include tens of thousands of attendants and camels laden with gold. Musa distributed his wealth so lavishly along the route that the value of gold itself collapsed in Cairo for years afterward. Arab historians marveled at his generosity, recording that he built mosques and schools along the way, endowing learning with the same metal that others coveted as treasure. In his hands, gold was not just wealth, it was divine stewardship, a tool to glorify God and uplift his people. Timbuktu, under Mali and later Songhai, became the symbol of this golden age. Its markets bustled with scholars, merchants, and pilgrims, while its universities drew thinkers from across the Islamic world. Gold dust, weighed in tiny leather pouches, served as currency in these markets, binding together a network that stretched from the Niger River to Cairo and even to Venice, for merchants in Europe who saw their coins debased and their monarchs indebted. Tales of Timbuktu's riches sounded like dreams. Maps of the period often showed a crowned king of Mali holding a golden nugget, a symbol of Africa's glittering allure. Yet, as so often in history, abundance invited envy. By the 15th century, Portuguese explorers had begun skirting the African coast, seeking direct access to the sources of West Africa's gold. What began as trade soon turned to exploitation, and by the 16th century, European colonizers redirected their hunger from gold itself to an even darker commerce, enslaved human beings. The same coasts that had once sent caravans of gold across the Sahara now witnessed the ships of the Atlantic slave trade, carrying millions into bondage. The glow of Mali's golden age dimmed, its wealth consumed by new powers who sought not partnership but domination. For ordinary people of West Africa, gold had been both blessing and burden. It brought prosperity, knowledge, and contact with the wider world, but it also drew the eyes of conquerors. In villages along the Niger, families passed down small golden ornaments as heirlooms, while in cities, merchants weighed dust with care. Gold was survival, reputation, and identity. But when foreign powers arrived, that same metal painted targets on their backs. From our vantage point in 2025, the story of West Africa resonates powerfully. Gold that once destabilized Cairo's markets in the 14th century is echoed in modern. Concerns about how sudden flows of wealth oil minerals or capital can unsettle economies today. And Mansa Musa's pilgrimage, remembered as the grandest display of wealth in human history, reminds us how deeply gold is woven into memory, not just as treasure, but as symbol. His story still circulates online, sometimes exaggerated, sometimes mythologized, but always pointing to the same truth. Humanity's imagination has always been caught by gold's glow. Thus, the kingdoms of West Africa teach us that gold can elevate societies to heights of learning and faith, but it can also draw outsiders whose hunger reshapes destinies. Gold is promise, but it is also peril, and in its light, we see both the brilliance of human achievement and the shadows of human greed. If West Africa's golden dust traveled north across the Sahara, it often found its way into the bustling markets of the Middle East, where the Islamic world transformed bullion into both commerce and beauty. For centuries, the lands between the Mediterranean and the Persian Gulf were not only centers of faith, but also crossroads of trade, scholarship, and empire, and at the heart of these exchanges gleamed gold. Under the Abbasid Caliphate, which rose in the 8th century with its capital in Baghdad, gold diners became a symbol of stability in a vast and diverse empire, minted with care and often inscribed with verses from the Quran. These coins circulated from Spain to India, uniting regions with a shared standard of trust. Travelers like Ibn Khaldun and al-Muqaddasi remarked on the reliability of diners in markets, a contrast to the clipped or debased coins that plagued other lands. In many ways, the dinar was more than currency. It was a statement that commerce could flourish under the discipline of faith and the promise of purity. But gold, in the Islamic world, was never only money. it was also art. Mosques glimmered with golden mosaics, domes shone with gilded tiles, and manuscripts were illuminated with golden leaf. The Dome of the Rock in Jerusalem, rebuilt and adorned in the early centuries of Islam, reflected not just piety, but permanence, the same permanence gold had symbolized in Egypt or India. Craftsmen of Damascus and Cairo hammered intricate filigree jewelry, while Ottoman artisans later fashioned golden calligraphy that shimmered like divine light. To create with gold was to honor the eternal, a belief that beauty itself could be a form of worship. The Ottoman Empire, rising in the 14th century and enduring 4 centuries, carried this golden tradition into new heights. Its currency, the sultany, struck in gold, was respected across Europe and Asia. In Istanbul's bazaars, merchants traded spices, silks, and jewels, often measured against the weight of Ottoman gold. For peasants in Anatolia, a small coin saved from harvest earnings was more than wealth was a shield against famine or taxation. For sultans, vast treasuries filled with bullion-funded armies, palaces, and the monumental mosques that still define the skyline of Istanbul. Yet the story was not one of endless stability. Gold's scarcity tested the resilience of empires. When wars drained treasuries, rulers were tempted to debase coins, mixing them with lesser metals. Chroniclers note how soldiers sometimes rioted when paid in debased currency, demanding gold. Instead, even in lands where faith proclaimed honesty and justice, the human hunger for more often eroded trust. And each time trust faltered, the instinct was the same as in Rome, Spain, or America. Return to gold. For ordinary people across the Islamic world, gold carried meanings layered like the calligraphy on a mosque's wall. It was a dowry in marriage, a security passed from mother to daughter. It was the shining ornament of feast days, offered in gratitude and devotion. And in times of uncertainty, whether famine, invasion, or political intrigue, was the lifeline tucked into clothing, hidden in jars, or carried on journeys into exile. From our vantage point in 2025, this history feels uncannily familiar. Just as Ottoman merchants demanded gold to anchor their contracts, modern investors seek its reassurance in an age of floating currencies and digital promises. Just as Abbasid diners stitched together a diverse empire, gold today bridges cultures and continents, trusted by both central banks and families alike. And just as artisans once transformed it into sacred art, today's societies, even amid financial anxiety, still find in its glow not only security but beauty. Thus, the story of gold in the Middle East reveals its duality as both material and metaphor. It was money, but it was also memory. It was ornament, but also order. And in its shimmering surfaces, we see the same instinct that is carried across all civilizations. The longing for something incorruptible in a world where everything else fades. Far to the south and east, where the monsoon winds carried ships across the Indian Ocean, another chapter of gold's story unfolded. In Southeast Asia, kingdoms like Srivijaya, Majapahit, and the mighty Khmer Empire of Angkor discovered that gold was not only a substance to be mined or minted, it was a language of power, religion, and trade. Here, gold shimmered in temples, moved along sea routes, and served as both ornament and offering. The Srivijaya Empire, centered in Sumatra between the 7th and 13th centuries, controlled the maritime choke point of the Malacca Strait, the gateway between India and China. Merchants from Arabia, India, and China funneled through its harbors, exchanging spices, porcelain, and silks. Gold flowed through these exchanges, much of it mined from the rivers and highlands of Southeast Asia. Chinese chronicles describe how the Srivijayan rulers sent tribute missions laden with gold, affirming both wealth and loyalty to the Middle Kingdom. In return, they received recognition that bolstered their prestige. In these transactions, gold was diplomacy made tangible. Further north, the Khmer Empire of Angkor built temples that still astound modern visitors. Angkor Wat, the great temple dedicated to Vishnu, was once adorned with golden finials, statues, and ornaments designed to reflect the radiance of the divine. Accounts from Chinese envoys speak of golden towers that gleamed in the tropical sun, visible for miles across the plains. For the Khmer, gold was the color of the gods, a symbol of cosmic order. It was hammered into crowns, worn by kings who were seen as Devaraja god-kings, linking heaven and earth. The brilliance of gold was not luxury, but legitimacy, proof that the monarch ruled by divine mandate, Majapahit, which succeeded Sravijaya in Java, also wielded gold as a symbol of maritime dominance. In its courts, golden jewelry and ritual objects testified to the empire's control of trade networks, stretching from the Philippines to Bali. Coins stamped with Sanskrit inscriptions circulated alongside Chinese cash, binding together a cosmopolitan economy. Gold here was not hoarded. In vaults it was worn, displayed, and offered in rituals that fused Hindu, Buddhist, and indigenous beliefs. To hold gold was to participate in a cultural tapestry that reached across the Indian Ocean. Yet, as in every corner of history, abundance drew outsiders. By the 16th century, Portuguese and later Dutch merchants sought to dominate these same sea lanes, eyeing not only the spices, but also the gold that lubricated trade. Local rulers found themselves bargaining with newcomers who valued the metal, less for its spiritual significance, and more as collateral for European wars. Temples that once gleamed with golden ornaments were looted. Treasuries that once anchored kingdoms were drained into global markets. Still, for ordinary people of Southeast Asia, gold retained its intimate role. Farmers offered small golden figurines at shrines to ensure good harvests. Families passed down golden earrings and necklaces as heirlooms, worn at weddings and festivals. Even as colonial powers redefined trade, the cultural meaning of gold remained resilient. It was not only wealth, but also blessing. In villages along the Mekong or the coasts of Java, a golden ornament was both adornment and insurance. Beauty and security bound together. From our perspective, in 2025, the story of Southeast Asia resonates as part of a global pattern. Just as Egyptians linked gold to eternity, Indians to auspiciousness, and Chinese to cosmic order, the peoples of Southeast Asia saw it as the radiant thread connecting human life to divine cycles. And just as in other regions, its abundance made it both a blessing and a target. Thus Part 4 closes with a lesson echoed across continents. No matter the culture, no matter the faith, gold became more than metal. It was a mirror of humanity's deepest desires for permanence, for prosperity, for meaning. Whether hammered into crowns, melted into coins, or hidden in lockets, its glow tied civilizations to their gods, their rulers, and their hopes. If you are still listening, perhaps let me know in the comments. Leave a gentle one if you're awake, or a Z if the story has carried you toward sleep. And, as always, a like and a quiet subscribe will help us continue these journeys into history's golden corridors together. When the Cold War ended in 1991, much of the world seemed to exhale. The great rivalry that had defined decades gave way to talk of globalization, free markets, and what some optimistically called the end of history. Stock markets swelled, new technologies promised abundance, and international institutions proclaimed a new age of integration. In this confident atmosphere, gold appeared almost irrelevant, a relic of darker times. Its price drifted lower, hovering in the doldrums, as investors poured their faith into booming equities and emerging economies. But history has its own rhythm, and gold never disappears, it waits. By the mid-1990s, cracks in the shining narrative began to show. Developing nations, lured by easy credit and global enthusiasm, borrowed heavily in dollars, Their currencies were pegged tightly to the US dollar, promising stability, yet leaving them vulnerable when capital turned fickle. In 1997, the illusion shattered. The Asian financial crisis began in Thailand, where the baht collapsed after the government could no longer defend its fixed exchange rate. Contagion spread rapidly in Indonesia, South Korea, Malaysia, and beyond. Saw their currencies plunge, their banks fail, and millions thrown into unemployment. International lenders demanded austerity, while governments struggled to keep order amid protests and riots. For families who had trusted banks and paper money, the crash was devastating. Life savings evaporated overnight. In these moments of despair, gold revealed its enduring role. In Indonesia, families rushed to pawn shops, exchanging jewelry for cash to buy food. In Thailand, stories circulated of households selling heirloom ornaments to survive. In Korea, a remarkable campaign emerged. Ordinary citizens voluntarily donated gold wedding rings, necklaces, and even medals to help their government repay debts and stabilize the nation's reserves. The act was both patriotic and deeply human, a recognition that when paper falters, metal still carries unquestioned worth. Newspapers captured images of long lines outside collection points, where citizens handed over treasures not as commodities, but as symbols of trust in their country's future. Globally, the crisis reminded investors that prosperity is never as permanent as it appears. Gold prices, though not soaring dramatically, steadied amid the storm, offering a contrast to currencies that crumbled overnight. For many in Asia, the lesson became generational: diversify, save in metal if possible, and never forget how fragile markets can be. Even today, in 2025, echoes of that memory linger. Families in Seoul or Jakarta still keep small stores of gold as quiet insurance, a habit born in the chaos of 1997. The late 1990s delivered further shocks. The Russian default of 1998, when Moscow declared it could no longer meet its obligations, rattled global markets. The hedge fund, long-term capital management, celebrated as a marvel of mathematical finance, collapsed under the weight of bets gone wrong, nearly dragging the system with it. Once again, faith in paper sophistication faltered, while gold's simplicity stood unchanged. For ordinary people in those years, gold was rarely an investment. Chasing profit, it was a last resort, a comfort when the abstractions of global finance revealed their brittleness. A necklace or a coin was something that could be carried, pawned, or traded when banks locked their doors and currencies withered. In a world that proclaimed itself borderless and rational, gold remained the quiet reminder that human trust is never infinite. From our perspective, in 2025, the 1990s look like a rehearsal for the crises to come. Optimism swelling into bubbles, bubbles bursting into fear, and fear returning us to the same old refuge. Gold, patient and incorruptible, played its role, not by dazzling, but by enduring. Thus, as the new millennium approached, the world stood between triumph and tremor. The dreams of globalization promised a golden age, but the metal itself whispered caution, reminding us that history does not end. And trust, once shaken, always searches for something that gleams unchanged. The dawn of the new millennium carried with it both euphoria and unease. Technology promised a future unbound. The internet was transforming commerce, communication, even daily life. In the late 1990s, dot-com companies multiplied like stars in the digital sky, their stock valuations soaring to fantastical heights. Wall Street traders spoke of a new economy, one in which old rules no longer applied. Paper fortunes expanded as quickly as websites appeared, yet behind the excitement lay fragility, for many of these companies had no profits, no business models, only promises. When the bubble burst in 2000, it was as sudden as it was brutal. Stock indices plunged, wiping out trillions in wealth. Investors who had believed in infinite growth discovered, once again, that paper can dissolve overnight. Amid the wreckage, gold stirred. Though its price had languished through the 1990s, mocked as irrelevant, it began to climb slowly, cautiously, as if reasserting itself against the arrogance of digital. Optimism then came September 11, 2001. The attacks on New York and Washington shattered the illusion that prosperity alone could shield societies from catastrophe. Markets closed in stunned silence. Planes were grounded. Millions watched live as towers fell and smoke billowed into skies once thought untouchable. Fear was not abstract, it was visceral. In those days of uncertainty, when people wondered if the world itself had changed, irrevocably, gold quietly surged. Its price jumped as investors and citizens alike sought refuge in something that could not be toppled by fire or terror. The years that followed deepened this return to gold. The wars in Afghanistan and Iraq drained treasuries and unsettled economies. The Federal Reserve, seeking to prevent recession, lowered interest rates to historic lows, fueling credit booms that would later prove dangerous. Deficits grew, debts expanded, and whispers circulated that America's empire, like so many before it, might find its strength bleeding away in distant conflicts. Each uncertainty nudged gold upward, reinforcing its role as the old constant. In new storms by the mid-2000s, another bubble was forming, this time in housing. Families bought homes at inflated prices, convinced they could only rise further. Banks packaged risky loans into complex securities, stamped them with labels of safety, and sold them worldwide. To most, the system looked stable, even prosperous. But beneath the surface, those who remembered history sensed fragility. Gold, ever the barometer of distrust, reflected that unease. From lows around $250 an ounce in 1999, it had risen past $600 by 2006. It was not mania. It was anticipation, as if the metal itself knew that the illusions of paper were preparing to collapse once more. For ordinary people in the 2000s, gold's return was subtle but real. Families who had ignored it during the booming 1990s began to buy small coins, jewelry, or bars. Immigrant households, recalling crises in their homelands, treated gold as insurance. Investors, burned by the dot-com collapse, sought diversification, and in moments like 9/11's, when the very sense of security cracked, gold's glow was less about profit than about comforts, something ancient, incorruptible, untouchable by the chaos of men. Looking back from 2025, the early 2000s feel like a prelude, a tightening spiral that led inevitably to the great unraveling of 2008. Gold's slow, steady climb during those years was not a speculative frenzy, but a whisper of warning. It was the quiet reminder, as it has always been, that trust is fragile, prosperity fleeting, and fear eternal. Thus, the 2000s marked the beginning of gold's modern revival. In an age of terrorism, war, and reckless speculation, the world rediscovered that the ancient refuge was never truly gone. It had only been waiting, patient as ever, for the next storm. By 2007, the cracks in the housing market were visible too. Anyone willing to look. Mortgages had been handed out to families who could scarcely afford them, bundled into complex securities, and sold across the world as if they were unbreakable. Credit default swaps those, arcane insurance. Contracts spread like invisible webs, linking banks from New York to London to Tokyo. The system appeared stable on the surface, yet it was like a great dam, its walls already trembling from the pressure within. When the dam broke in 2008, it shattered confidence more violently than any single event since 1929. Bear Stearns collapsed in March. Lehman Brothers followed in September. filing for bankruptcy after 158 years of history. The dominoes fell quickly, e.g. Wachovia. Merrill Lynch names that had once seemed eternal, now dissolved in headlines of panic. Markets plummeted, credit froze, and families around the world discovered that what they thought was secure could disappear in a single season, and into this darkness stepped gold. Its role was not dramatic at first. It was steady, rising as each new shock rattled the system. But after Lehman's collapse, demand for gold accelerated like a stampede. Investors sold stocks, dumped real estate, and sought safety in the only asset that seemed incorruptible. By 2011, amid ongoing tremors from the European debt crisis, gold soared above $1,900 an ounce, its highest price in history up to that time. What drove this surge was not mere speculation. It was fear, layered upon fear. People feared the printed trillions from the Federal Reserve and the European Central Bank would unleash runaway inflation. They feared banks would collapse, governments default, and currencies lose their meaning. In Athens, Rome, and Madrid, citizens lined up outside banks, watching governments impose austerity measures demanded by creditors. In America, families who had lost jobs and homes wondered whether the system had been rigged against them from the start. Against such doubts, gold's gleam felt like truth. Coin shops reported shortages. Dealers raised premiums as demand outstripped supply. In India, families who had long treated gold as sacred marriage, wealth began buying more aggressively, seeing it as protection against global uncertainty. In China, citizens were encouraged to buy gold by their own government, diversifying away from dollar-heavy reserves. For a moment, gold became not only a personal refuge, but a geopolitical one. A quiet counterbalance in a world where trust in paper was shaken to its core. For ordinary people, the lesson of 2008 was harsh and unforgettable. They realized that the institutions they trusted, banks, governments, markets, could falter in days. Retirement savings shrank by half. Homes lost value. Jobs vanished. In that landscape of uncertainty, the simplest of assets, a gold coin, a bar, a necklace, felt more secure than any banknote or stock certificate. It was not about return. It was about survival. Looking back from 2025, we can see that 2008 reshaped the psychology of a generation. Even though inflation never exploded, as many feared, the memory of that panic lingers. Today, each time markets stumble or governments quarrel over debt ceilings, investors whisper about 2008, and glance again toward gold. The crisis proved what history had always suggested. Gold does not prevent storms, but it is the raft people cling to when the waters rise. Thus, in 2008, gold's ancient role re-emerged with undeniable force. It was the lifeboat, the safe haven, the last anchor when the modern financial world cracked under its own illusions. And in its glow, humanity rediscovered what Egyptians, Romans, and countless others had known, that in times of despair, we reach for the one metal that never betrays us. The storm of 2008 left behind not calm seas, but a world transformed. To prevent another collapse, central banks embarked on policies once thought unthinkable. Quantitative easing QE became the mantra of the new decade. The Federal Reserve bought government bonds by the trillions, expanding its balance sheet, two levels that would have seemed absurd a generation earlier. The European Central Bank and the Bank of Japan followed suit. Money was cheap, abundant, and seemingly infinite. For policymakers, this was innovation. For ordinary citizens, it was unsettling. On the surface, the strategy worked. Stock markets recovered, soaring to heights no one would have believed in 2009. Unemployment, after years of stagnation, began to fall. Politicians proclaimed that the system had been saved. Yet beneath this veneer of stability, unease simmered. If money could be created without limit, what was its true value? Could prosperity built on endless liquidity endure? It was in this climate of both relief and suspicion that gold continued to hold its quiet place. The early 2010s saw gold remain near historic highs. In 2011, amid the European sovereign debt crisis, it touched nearly $1,900 an ounce again. The sight of Greek pensioners queuing at shuttered banks, or Italian bonds teetering on the edge of default, reminded the world how fragile even wealthy nations could be. For many Europeans, gold became not just a hedge but a symbol of independence from governments they no longer trusted. In India and China, demand surged, with millions buying small bars and coins as household insurance. Central banks themselves, once net sellers of gold, reversed course and began to buy, quietly rebuilding reserves, as if remembering that trust in paper must always be backed by something more eternal. Yet as the decade progressed, confidence in paper regained strength. Inflation remained subdued despite dire warnings. Stock markets offered dazzling returns, luring investors away from the sleepy glow of bullion. By 2013, gold began to fall sharply, slipping below $1,200 and lingering there for years. Commentators declared, once again, that the metal was finished. They pointed to booming technology stocks, cheap mortgages, and steady growth as proof that gold had lost its relevance. But this dismissal overlooked a deeper truth. Gold had not failed. It had simply performed its ancient duty. It had soared during fear, then receded when confidence returned. Families who had bought gold in 2008 or 2011 may have watched prices slip, but they also knew that their insurance remained intact. A coin, unlike a stock, does not default. A bar does not vanish when a bank collapses. For ordinary households, in India, China, Turkey, or even in America, gold remained less about speculation and more about continuity. A wedding necklace, a dowry, a coin tucked away, these endured, indifferent to markets. Meanwhile, governments quietly prepared for storms they hoped would never come. Russia and China in particular accelerated gold purchases, diversifying away from the dollar-dominated system. By the late 2010s, their reserves had swelled, signaling that even great powers shared the ancient instinct of ordinary families. Trust paper when you must, but keep gold when you can. Looking back from 2025, the decade of the 2010s appears deceptively calm. A long exhale after the chaos of 2008, yet its calm was artificial, propped up by money creation and low interest. Gold's retreat during those years lulled many into believing it had been demoted to irrelevance. But history teaches otherwise. The metal's slumber was not death, but patience, waiting for the next crisis that would inevitably awaken it. Thus, the 2010s confirmed gold's cyclical role. It is not the fuel of booms, but the refuge of fears. When confidence flourishes, it withdraws into shadows. When doubt rises, it returns to the center stage. And in that rhythm lies the lesson humanity has never quite learned. Prosperity without fear is temporary, but gold's permanence is eternal. The decade of the 2020s began not with confidence, but with crisis. The pandemic of 2020 froze economies in their tracks, forcing governments into unprecedented experiments in money creation. Trillions of dollars, euros, and yen were poured into households and businesses, a lifeline that kept societies afloat, while entire cities fell silent under lockdowns. For a moment, it seemed that prosperity could be manufactured by decree. Yet, when the world emerged from isolation, it found that money was not conjured without consequence. By 2021 and 2022, inflation surged across the globe, reaching levels unseen in decades. Gasoline prices spiked, groceries climbed relentlessly, and rents rose faster than wages. Central banks, once reassuring that inflation was transitory, scrambled to reverse course, raising interest rates at the fastest pace since Paul Volcker's era. The Federal Reserve in particular faced a dilemma: tame inflation with painful rate hikes, or risk allowing the dollar's credibility to erode. As policymakers wrestled, ordinary families bore the brunt. Paychecks stretched thin, savings eroded, and the quiet unease of the 1970s seemed to have returned in a modern guise. Meanwhile, geopolitics magnified the uncertainty. Russia's invasion of Ukraine in 2022 not only upended security in Europe, but also disrupted global energy and food markets. Sanctions, weaponized currencies, freezing reserves, and reminding nations that fiat money, unlike gold, could be blocked or seized. China, wary of such vulnerability, accelerated its gold purchases, while central banks, from Asia to the Middle East, followed suit. In 2022 and 2023, global central bank demand for gold hit record highs, the strongest since the 1960s, a striking vote of no confidence in the permanence of paper promises. For ordinary people, the storm felt immediate and personal. Families in Europe struggled with soaring heating bills. Americans felt sticker shock at grocery stores. Households in emerging economies faced currency devaluations that made imports unaffordable. In such times, gold once again became the quiet insurance. In India, weddings sparked waves of gold buying despite high prices. In Turkey, where the lira plunged, citizens lined up at shops to convert savings into gold coins and jewelry. Across continents, the instinct was the same. When trust in governments weakens, cling to what endures. By 2024 and into 2025, inflation cooled, but unease lingered. Markets remained volatile. Central banks hesitated between loosening and tightening, and political divisions deepened in the United States and Europe. Each tremor, each headline, kept gold near historic highs. Its role was not about growth. It's about resilience. In vaults, in households, in jewelry boxes, gold reminded people that the ancient refuge was still alive. The irony of the 2020s is clear. Even in an age of artificial intelligence, digital currencies, and quantum computing, the world continues to seek safety in a metal dug from the earth, hammered into coins, and treasured by civilizations for millennia. Technology changes, politics shifts, economies rise and fall, but the psychology of fear remains the same. And gold, inert, yet incorruptible, answers that fear as faithfully now as it did in the days of pharaohs and emperors. For ordinary listeners today, the lesson is not complicated. Gold will not make you rich in times of prosperity. It will not deliver steady dividends, but when trust falters, when currencies wobble, when governments stumble, when headlines scream of war, gold waits quietly, offering reassurance that something still holds its value, no matter what storms rage outside. Thus, as Part 5 comes to a close, the story of the 2020s reaffirms the oldest truth. Crises may change their shape, but our instinct never does. We run to gold not out of greed, but out of longing for permanence in a fleeting world. And if you've stayed with me through this golden journey, let me know with a quiet one in the comments or a gentle Z if sleep has already carried you away. A like and subscribe will help us keep sharing these midnight histories, weaving together past and present in the timeless glow of gold. As we close this long journey together, let us step back and look at the path we have walked, from the riverbeds of ancient Nubia to the glittering tombs of pharaohs, from the bazaars of Baghdad to the caravans of Mali, from the temples of the Inca to the vaults of Wall Street. One theme has endured. In every age of doubt, humanity turns to gold, not because it can feed the hungry or shelter the homeless, but because it offers something rarer, permanence. We saw how Egypt saw gold as the flesh of the gods, incorruptible and eternal. How India carried it as auspicious blessing, passed from mother to daughter as a thread of continuity. How China linked it to immortality, shaping ingots like vessels of heaven. How the Aztec and Inca wove it into rituals, only to see it melted in conquest. How West African kings turned it into legend, so dazzling that Mansa Musa's pilgrimage reshaped economies from Cairo to Mecca. How the Abbasid dinar and Ottoman sultanate carried commerce across continents, binding empires with trust. How Khmer kings gilded their temples, catching sunlight like an earthly promise of the divine. We followed it further into Europe's Renaissance, where galleons poured gold and silver into Spain, bringing not stability but inflation and debt, into the banks of Amsterdam and London, where gold was institutionalized as the anchor of trust, into the 19th century, when the gold standard disciplined governments, yet bound farmers and workers in chains of scarcity, into the early 20th century, when war and depression shattered the system, but gold's memory remained, into Bretton Woods, when America's dollar stood in gold's place, and into 1971, when that tether was cut and fiat money took command. We traced its modern return, the stagflation of the 1970s, when gold soared past $800, the illusions of the 1980s and 1990s, when gold slumbered while markets and technology boomed, the trauma of 2008, when it surged past $1,900, vindicating those who kept faith in its permanence, the strange decade of the 2010s, when QE printed oceans of money, and yet inflation remained subdued, lulling many into believing the storm had passed. Then the pandemic of 2020, when unprecedented printing and global panic sent gold to new records above $2,000, and finally into the 2020s, where inflation, war, and uncertainty keep it near the center of the world's imagination. Why do we keep returning to gold? Because gold is not just metal. It is memory, condensed into shine. It is trust, crystallized in weight. It is hope, hammered into coins, worn as rings, passed as dowries, hidden in jars, locked in vaults. Its power is not economic alone, but psychological. When fear rises, people seek something beyond words and promises. And there, in its unchanging glow, gold offers what no government, no central bank, no algorithm can. The assurance that some things endure. And yet, if this journey has taught us anything, it is that gold is not salvation. It does not prevent war, nor cure famine, nor create prosperity. It cannot substitute for wisdom, compassion, or courage. Gold is a mirror, reflecting our anxieties and our aspirations. When trust fails, we run to it. When trust returns, we drift away. The cycle is eternal because human nature is eternal. So what, then, should we learn as we sit here in 2025, in a world anxious about inflation, about political division, about global uncertainty? Perhaps the lesson is this: gold can be a refuge, but it should not be our only one. The true anchors of society are not bars and vaults, but bonds between people, trust between neighbors, compassion across differences, faith that, even when systems falter, communities can endure. Gold is permanence in matter, but the permanence we need most is in spirit. Think of the Korean families in 1997, who gave up their wedding rings to save their country's credit. Think of the peasants in Rome, who buried coins so their children might survive famine. Think of the Indian mothers who passed bangles to their daughters as blessings for future generations. These are not stories of metal alone. They are stories of human resilience, of people who found strength in continuity, who refused to let fear consume them. Gold's story is our story, anxious, hopeful, enduring. And as we look ahead, we can carry its lesson without being enslaved. by its glow. Let it remind us that permanence is possible, that some things can outlast storms. But let us also remember that the true wealth of humanity lies not in what we hoard, but in what we build together: trust, solidarity, kindness. So tonight, as this golden tale winds down, perhaps you feel calmer, perhaps even sleepy. If so, let the story drift with you into rest, as steady as the glow of an eternal flame. And if you're still awake, still listening, know that you are part of a long chain of listeners across time, each seeking the same comfort, that something endures. Thank you for sharing this journey with me. If you enjoyed wandering through these midnight corridors of history, consider leaving a like, subscribing for more, and sharing your thoughts in the comments. Tell me, do you trust gold as a refuge, or do you see safety elsewhere? Each voice adds light to our shared story. Until next time, may your sleep be peaceful, your dreams steady, and may you carry with you the quiet reminder that, in every age, even in ours, the human heart still glows brighter than gold.